Now to Washington, where high-level trade talks between Canada and the U.S. are finally back on. The lead minister on the file, Dominic LeBlanc, is there for the first high-level meeting since President Trump suspended those talks last year. The CBC's Kate McKenna joins us now from the D.C. Bureau. Kate, what happened today?
Well, Dominic LeBlanc met with Jamieson Greer at the USTR office, and these were, of course, highly anticipated talks, a restarting of talks between Canada and the U.S. after Donald Trump abruptly called them off last year following that Ontario anti-tariff ad featuring Ronald Reagan. We tried to catch up with Dominic LeBlanc as he was leaving the meeting at about the end of the morning. Take a watch, see what happened.
How are your talks? What did you talk about? What do you hope to accomplish from these talks? Minister, anything to say at all?
So we weren't able to talk to him, as you can see there, but we did in the last few minutes actually get a readout from his office about what they discussed. The readout from the office says that he introduced the USTR to Canada's new chief negotiator, Jenna Charette, as well as Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Mark Wiseman. Of course, those are people who are new in those roles following Donald Trump calling off trade talks. It also says that they talked about bilateral issues between both countries. We can imagine what some of those might have been. For instance, the sectoral tariffs that are affecting Canadian steel and aluminum, auto parts, other sectors. And then for the United States, they've been pretty clear on what their irritants are as well. We can think of softwood lumber. We can think of Arctic security, the dairy quotas. It doesn't go into that granular detail, but those are things that have been discussed in the past. And of course, the big issue that is sort of looming, which is this review of CUSMA, the free trade agreement. So the readout describes these conversations as substantive and says that Jamieson Greer and Dominic LeBlanc will continue talking, which hopefully signals a better, more productive time in Canada-U.S. trade talks.
Dominic LeBlanc there clearly didn't want to say anything, which in past times when he's sort of gone to those meetings, whether it be with Howard Lutnick or other, he has stopped to talk. So something has changed there. How significant is it, though, Kate, that LeBlanc is back in Washington?
Well, I think it's very significant. And it is also interesting that he doesn't want to talk at all, if even to say, that these are substantive conversations, like no interest in that at all, as we saw. However, they are back at the table. This is something that is privately being kind of touted to me as from the government side, a big deal. And of course, maybe a large part of what has them enthusiastic about that is this upcoming CUSMA review. I mean, we look at how things are going between Mexico and the U.S., Mexico obviously being the other partner in that free trade deal. Things seem to be progressing better. There are more meetings. There's less public sparring. I mean, in recent weeks, we've seen Donald Trump criticize Canada for losing the Olympic gold medal. We've seen, some might say Mark Carney was kind of poking him in the eye with the Davos speech and then Trump's reaction to that. There has been some public fighting between both countries. And Mexico has managed to avoid that, and they are launching some joint review talks in the coming weeks. I was speaking to a former advisor for Donald Trump on trade earlier today. Here's what he had to say about how he perceives things to be going between Canada and the U.S.
I think the discussions with Mexico are much deeper, much more frequent. The fact that there hasn't been a real engagement at that level for quite some time, it makes this a significant event, demonstrates that there hasn't been the kind of dialogue really to move the relationship forward. So it's good, and it always is good to meet face to face. Whether it's enough to really propel negotiations forward, I think there's still a ways to go.
Whether or not today ends up being that day that ends up propelling trade talks forward remains to be seen. But based on the readout, it sounds like these talks are going to continue.
All right, Kate McKenna in Washington. Thank you, Kate.
You're welcome.
For more on this, we are joined by Brian Clow, who is Deputy Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and handled Canada-U.S. relations under the former Prime Minister. Brian, were you expecting any breakthroughs as a result of this meeting?
Good to be here with you. No, I was not expecting breakthroughs, and I think Canadians should not expect any public breakthroughs for many months. This negotiation is going to go on for months. It's going to lead into this July 1st review date, which is stipulated in the CUSMA deal. And I think we'll see a lot of days like today where meetings happen, not much is said, these negotiations happen confidentially, and we may learn little bits along the way, but I think we'll learn most of this towards the end of this negotiation, closer to summer.
Do you think we're at a moment where Canada needs to make some sort of breakthrough goodwill gesture in order to sort of facilitate a possible breakthrough? I'm thinking possibly should the federal government try to convince some of the provinces perhaps to maybe drop their bans on American booze? Are we at that point where Canada needs to do something to maybe perhaps move things in the direction Canada wants to see?
Well, if that happened, if Canada did do that, in the example you gave, dropping some of the booze bans provincially, certainly the Americans would look at that as a positive thing, and I think that would move the ball forward. But what the government has to grapple with at the same time is every time you make a move like that and you make a concession, are you giving something away for free? And we saw last year the government did make a few moves. It dropped retaliation, it dropped the digital services tax, and seemingly got nothing in return. So while I think dangling some potential moves from the Canadian side to the American side might get them interested in talking more and might bring the temperature a bit down a bit, frankly, I don't expect the government to do that now, and I think they'll hold their cards until a deal is coming together.
And if I recall correctly, at the time when that was happening, you thought it was a mistake on behalf of the Carney government. And now, months later, do you still think it's a mistake?
I do think the moves last year, they might have been necessary. There were good reasons to do them last year. Canada was under intense pressure from the president. So I don't know that I would call it a mistake, but I do believe we didn't get anything for it.
U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, he has announced that he'll be holding bilateral talks with his Mexican counterpart starting next week. Is Mexico ahead of the game when it comes to these talks? Because we don't have that same kind of an announcement for Canada.
I wouldn't, while the words on the page and the press release we saw coming out of yesterday's Mexico meeting spoke to a little bit of progress, there was a positive tone there about future meetings. I'm not a believer that the Mexican-U.S. negotiation is going that much better than the Canada negotiation. They're still being hit with tariffs. They have a lot of tough issues with this president, including a lot of issues we don't have to deal with, like migration and security issues in the same way. So the tone does appear to be a little bit better, but I think it's overstated what position the Mexicans are in when compared to the Canadians.
After the State of the Union address by U.S. President Donald Trump last week, I spoke with Jamieson Greer, and I asked him a little bit about, what he wants to see from Canada. And he made the argument that if Canada wants to have some kind of deal with the United States, Canada just has to accept being hit by a higher tariff. From your perspective, is that a non-starter?
Well, this speaks directly to the challenge the Canadian government has right now. And frankly, a bit of a different challenge than what we faced in Trump's first term. In the first term, we were dealing with a very tough U.S. administration, a very tough president. It's the same president, obviously. They had a lot of demands on Canada. But at the end of the day, in the first term, they were working towards a deal, and they were willing to bargain. This time around, Trump 2.0, it seems that the Trump administration just wants a bunch of unilateral concessions from Canada. They want us to give up a bunch of things in a bunch of file areas that are important to Canada and to Canadians, and they want to keep the tariffs on that they already have in place. If that remains the American position, then what does Canada have to do here? What deal is there to even discuss? I'm sure this was part of the meeting today, scoping out on the Canadian side where exactly the Americans might be willing to deal.
I'm curious, you have such a unique perspective when it comes to Canada-U.S. relations because of your role during your time when Justin Trudeau was Prime Minister. You were in the room for the stuff with Donald Trump. You were sort of behind the scenes, sort of leading the Canada response to whatever the Trump administration was dealing with. I'm curious, in this moment, how would you describe the state of the Canada-U.S. relationship?
It's not a good situation right now. It is a very tough situation. And further to my previous answer, it's tougher than it was in the first term, which was itself a very difficult situation for Canada. And that's because the Trump administration is that much more emboldened, that much more unified in its views, its tariff policy, its trade policies. And not only that, they're threatening our sovereignty. They are questioning our commitment to North American security. So put all that together, it makes the situation very strained. And look how the Trump administration has reacted to what Canada has done. Canada went and did a fairly minor, I would say, deal on cars with China, and they erupted very negatively. And it's because they feel their views about China, they feel it in their bones. They don't like seeing Canada do a deal like that. But that's just one example of how tough and strained things are right now.
Something I've heard consistently from Canadian officials who deal with this file is a bad deal is worse than no deal. Do you think we need to start having a conversation in this country? Is it the time to consider perhaps Canada doesn't have a three-way trade agreement with the U.S. and Mexico?
Well, I wouldn't go that far at this stage, but entering into these talks, it would not be a good negotiating position if you believe that you must absolutely come out of this with maintaining the CUSMA or any other thing. You have to be willing to walk away if the demands on the other side are too much and if the other side is just refusing to bargain. I don't think CUSMA is going to fall apart, far from it. There are a lot of American interests who are telling the U.S. administration that it needs to be maintained. So I think that scenario is extremely unlikely. But I think the more likely scenario, which is still a not great scenario for Canada, is we remain in the situation we're in right now, where July comes and goes, the deal is not renewed, but it doesn't die either. So we stay in the situation where all of the sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, auto, lumber, they stay in place, and the tension between the two countries remains very intense.
One last question really quickly, because we've run out of time, but there is one additional sort of volatility that could factor into this moment. This is an election year in the United States, and it is widely believed that because Donald Trump is so unpopular in America right now, that the Republican Party could lose control of the House and could have some losses in the Senate. Does Canada need to sort of change how it's dealing with the Trump administration? Perhaps maybe it's on a weakened footing, and is that something that could be to Canada's advantage?
It's definitely a factor. If the election in the midterm elections in November result in a Congress that is more willing to stand up to this president and stand up to this administration, the Congress has not done that so far in Trump's second term. If Congress becomes emboldened, then that is probably a good thing for Canada. And so it's definitely one factor, but it's one of many, many factors that need to be considered right now.
Okay, Brian Clow, former Deputy Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, thank you.
Thank you very much.